The shot rang out, echoing across the dusty plains of Colorado Territory as Zoe Reynolds slumped forward in her saddle, her vision blurring as blood spread across the bodice of her blue traveling dress. "That'll teach you to carry valuables through Crow Canyon," were the last words she heard before darkness claimed her. The year was 1872, and the promise of a new life had brought 24-year-old Zoe west from Philadelphia following her father's death. With nothing but her mother's jewelry and $200 sewn into the lining of her dress, she had boarded a stagecoach bound for Greeley, Colorado, a burgeoning agricultural settlement that offered opportunities for educated women to teach. The journey had been long, but filled with hope, until 3 masked men intercepted her hired guide just 12 miles from her destination. Yates Parker crouched by the creek bed, filling his canteen while his horse, Thunder, grazed nearby. At 30 years old, he'd spent the better part of a decade working cattle drives across the territory, before finally settling on his modest spread outside Greeley. His weather-beaten face and calloused hands told the story of hard years on the frontier, but his eyes still held a kindness uncommon among men who'd seen what he had. The sound of an unaccompanied horse snorting nearby caught his attention. Pushing his hat back, Yates followed the sound to discover a bay mare wandering aimlessly, reins dragging in the dirt, saddle askew. "Whoa there, girl," he murmured, approaching slowly. The horse was lathered and skittish, had clearly been running hard. When he noticed the dark stains on the saddle, his heart quickened. Following the mare's tracks back through the brush, Yates discovered a scene that made his blood run cold. A woman lay crumpled in the dirt, her blonde hair fanned out around her, dress torn and blood-stained. Nearby, the body of a man, likely her guide, lay motionless, a bullet hole through his chest. Kneeling beside the woman, Yates gently brushed hair from her face. She couldn't have been much older than 25, with delicate features now pale as moonlight. Instinct told him to ride, on getting involved in whatever happened here could bring nothing but trouble, but something made him place 2 fingers against her neck. The pulse was there, faint but steady. "Miss, can you hear me?" Yates asked, his voice urgent as he assessed her injuries. A bullet had grazed her side, and she had a nasty gash on her temple, likely from falling from her horse. When she didn't respond, he knew decisions had to be made quickly. "Hold on now," he muttered, gathering her carefully into his arms. "I'm not letting you die out here." The ride back to his cabin was tense, with Yates constantly checking to ensure she was still breathing. He'd fashioned a makeshift bandage from his spare shirt, pressing it firmly against her wound, but blood continued to seep through at an alarming rate. His mind raced through the possibilities: bandits, most likely, or perhaps claimed jumpers who'd mistaken her for someone carrying mining profits. His cabin came into view just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the sparse landscape. It wasn't much a one-room structure with a small lean-to for his horse, but it had a sturdy roof and walls that kept out the worst of the Colorado winds. Inside, Yates cleared his table with one sweep of his arm, gently laying the unconscious woman upon it. Working quickly, he gathered clean cloths, whiskey for disinfection, and his sewing kit. He'd stitched up enough cowpunchers in his time to know the basics, though treating a woman felt different somehow. "Forgive me, miss," he murmured as he carefully cut away the blood-soaked fabric around her wound. The bullet had carved a deep furrow along her ribs, but mercifully hadn't penetrated her chest cavity. It was the blood loss and head wound that concerned him most. As Yates cleaned and stitched the wound, the woman moaned softly but didn't wake. He finished his work with steady hands, bandaged her side, then turned his attention to the gash on her head. After cleaning it thoroughly, he determined it wouldn't need stitches, just careful monitoring. With the immediate danger addressed, Yates gently lifted her from the table and placed her on his bed, covering her with his warmest blanket. He built up the fire in the small stone fireplace, then settled into his chair to keep vigil through the night. "Who are you?" he wondered aloud, studying her face in the firelight. "And who left you for dead out there?" Dawn broke with tendrils of pink and gold streaking across the eastern sky when Zoe first stirred. Pain radiated through her body in waves, and her mouth felt dry as cotton. For several moments, she couldn't remember where she was or what had happened. When she tried to move, agony lanced through her side, drawing a whimper from her lips. "Easy now," came a deep, gentle voice from somewhere nearby. You've been hurt pretty bad." Zoe's eyes fluttered open to find a man leaning over her, tall and broad-shouldered, with concerned hazel eyes and several days' worth of stubble on his jaw. Fear shot through her, and she tried to scramble away despite the pain. "Whoa there," he said, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "I'm not going to harm you. Found you half dead by the creek yesterday. You've been shot." The memories came flooding back: the stagecoach, the guide she'd hired in Denver, the 3 men who'd appeared on the trail demanding valuables. She remembered the guy drawing his pistol, the explosion of gunfire, the searing pain in her side as she'd kicked her horse and fled. "My guide?" she managed to ask, her voice hoarse. The man's expression grew somber. "I'm sorry, madam. He didn't make it." Tears welled in Zoe's eyes, guilt mingling with pain. She'd only known the guide for 2 days, but he'd seemed a decent man, just trying to make a living. "I'm Yates Parker," the man said, offering her a tin cup of water. "My ranch is about 12 miles outside of Greeley." "Zoe Reynolds," she replied after taking a careful sip. "I was traveling to Greeley for a teaching position." Yates nodded. "Figured you weren't from around here. Not many women travel these parts alone." "I wasn't supposed to be alone," Zoe said, wincing as she tried to sit up. "The stagecoach broke an axle in Denver. They said repairs would take 3 days, and I couldn't afford to wait. The school term starts next week." Yates helped her adjust to a more comfortable position, adding another pillow behind her back. "Well, Miss Reynolds, I don't think you'll be starting any school term soon. That wound needs time to heal, and you're in no condition to travel." Panic flashed across Zoe's features. "But I must get to Greeley, the position they're expecting me, and I have nowhere else to go." "I'll ride into town today. Let them know what happened," Yates offered. "Don't you worry about that now. First order of business is getting you well enough to stand without tearing those stitches." Zoe's hand moved to her side, feeling the bandages beneath the unfamiliar shirt she now wore. Realizing the implications, her cheeks flushed crimson. Noticing her discomfort, Yates quickly explained, "I had to tend your wound, but I was as proper as circumstances allowed, madam. I promise you that." "The shirt's mine, yours was beyond saving." Zoe nodded, embarrassment mixing with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Parker. You saved my life." "Yates, please," he corrected with a small smile. "And you're welcome, though any decent man would have done the same." "Not every man would have stopped," Zoe countered. "Many would have ridden on, fearing involvement in someone else's troubles." Yates shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Let me fix you something to eat. You need your strength." While Yates prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and coffee, Zoe took stock of her situation. The cabin was small but clean, with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn table and chairs, and shelves holding various provisions. A few books sat on a small shelf, surprising for a frontier rancher. "You read Emerson?" she asked, noting one of the volumes. Yates glanced over his shoulder, a hint of defensiveness in his expression. "Just because I work cattle doesn't mean I can't appreciate good writing. My mother was a schoolteacher back east." "I didn't mean to offend," Zoe said quickly. "I'm just pleasantly surprised. Most men I've encountered on my journey west seem to view books as frivolous luxuries." "Out here, luxuries are what keep you sane," Yates replied, setting a bowl before her. "Cattle don't make for stimulating conversation." That drew a small laugh from Zoe, which she immediately regretted as pain shot through her side. "I should know better than to laugh right now," she gasped. "But it's good to hear all the same," Yates said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Laughter means you're healing." After breakfast, Yates helped Zoe to a chair by the fire before preparing to ride into town. "I'll be back before sundown," he promised. "The sheriff should hear about what happened, and I'll stop by the school to explain your situation." Zoe nodded, suddenly anxious at the thought of being alone. "Be careful," she said. "Those men could still be out there." "I've ridden these trails for 10 years, Yates assured her. "I know how to keep my eyes open. There's a loaded rifle by the door if you need it, though I doubt anyone will come this way." Once Yates had departed, Zoe found the silence of the cabin oppressive. Her side throbbed with each heartbeat, but worse was the knowledge that everything she'd planned had been upended. The jewelry, her only inheritance and security, was gone, stolen by the men who'd left her for dead. The money sewn into her dress lining might still be there, but the dress itself was nowhere to be seen. "What now?" she whispered to the empty room. Without resources, without references or connections, her options were severely limited. The teaching position had been her sole hope for independence after her father's death, had left her virtually penniless. Determined not to wallow in self-pity, Zoe carefully rose and explored the cabin. Moving hurt, but staying still with her thoughts, hurt more. She found her dress, or what remained of it, folded neatly in a wooden chest. The bloodstains would never come out, but her fingers quickly found the hidden pocket where she'd secreted her money. Relief washed over her, at least she wasn't completely destitute. By midday, exhaustion forced her back to bed, where she drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with dreams of masked men and thundering hooves. Yates returned just as dusk was falling, his expression troubled as he entered the cabin. Zoe, who had been dozing by the fire, straightened at his arrival. "What did you learn?" she asked, reading the tension in his shoulders. "The sheriff's formed a posse," Yates explained, removing his hat and coat. "Your attackers have hit 3 parties in the past month. 2 people dead before your guide. They're getting bolder." Zoe shuddered, realizing how fortunate she'd been. "And the school?" At this, Yates's expression softened slightly. "The headmaster was concerned, said your letters had impressed him greatly. He's willing to hold the position for you for 2 weeks, but after that, they'll need to find someone else. The children need their education. 2 weeks." Zoe did a quick calculation. Even if her wound healed perfectly, she'd be weak, in pain. Teaching required standing for hours, managing rowdy children, writing on blackboards, all seemingly impossible tasks in her current condition. "I see," she said quietly, blinking back tears of frustration. "There's something else," Yates added, pulling a small package from his saddlebag. "Doc Wilson sent these for your wound, said to change the bandages twice daily and to watch for fever." "You told the doctor about me?" Zoe asked, surprised. "Had to," Yates replied pragmatically. "I know basic field medicine, but that's not enough for a gunshot wound. He wanted to ride out himself, but there was a difficult berth at the Miller farm. He'll try to come tomorrow." As Yates prepared dinner, a hearty stew that had been simmering all day in a Dutch oven outside, Zoe contemplated her situation. "I can't stay here indefinitely," she finally said. "It's not proper, and I'm already deeply in your debt." Yates turned from the stove, his expression serious. "Miss Reynolds, out here propriety sometimes takes a back seat to survival. You have nowhere else to go, and you need time to heal. My reputation can weather a few raised eyebrows." "And what of mine?" Zoe countered, though without heat. "A single woman staying unchaperoned with a bachelor." "I could sleep in the barn," Yates offered. "In October? Absolutely not," Zoe said firmly. "You've already given up your bed. I won't have you freezing for the sake of appearances." A small smile played at the corners of Yates's mouth. "Then it seems we're at an impasse, unless you're strong enough to ride to town tomorrow." They both knew she wasn't. Even sitting upright for this long had left her light-headed and in pain. 1 week, Zoe conceded. "By then, I should be well enough to travel to town, where I can find respectable lodgings while I determine my next steps." Yates nodded, though something like disappointment flickered briefly in his eyes. 1 week it is." That night, after changing her bandages with careful, respectful hands, Yates made his bed on the floor near the fireplace. As Zoe drifted toward sleep, she found herself studying his profile in the dying firelight, the strong jaw, the thoughtful set of his mouth. There was a gentleness to him that belied his rugged exterior, a quiet intelligence in the way he moved and spoke. "Thank you," she murmured, already half asleep, "for fighting for my life when everyone else left me for dead." If Yates responded, she didn't hear it, but she thought she felt the gentle touch of calloused fingers brushing hair from her forehead before sleep claimed her completely. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Doc Wilson arrived just after breakfast, his medical bag in hand and a stern expression on his weathered face. He was a short, barrel-chested man, with spectacles perched on his nose and a no-nonsense manner that reminded Zoe of her father. "So, you're the young lady Yates rescued," he said by way of greeting. "Let's have a look at what we're dealing with." While Yates waited outside for propriety's sake, the doctor examined Zoe's wounds with efficient movements. "Good stitching," he commented, inspecting Yates's handiwork. "Clean too, no sign of infection." "Will it heal properly?" Zoe asked anxiously. If you don't overexert yourself, yes. The bullet grazed you took some flesh, but didn't hit anything vital. You're fortunate, Miss Reynolds. Half an inch deeper, and we'd be having a very different conversation. The doctor left her with additional bandages, a tincture for pain, and strict instructions to rest. No traveling for at least 10 days, he insisted. That means no riding to town, no jostling in wagons, nothing that could tear those stitches. After he departed, Zoe relayed the doctor's orders to Yates, who seemed unsurprised. So, it seems you'll be my guest a bit longer than planned, he said, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. It appears so, Zoe agreed, though I insist on making myself useful. I can't abide being idle, and you've already done far too much. You can barely stand, Yates pointed out reasonably. I can sit and mend, Zoe countered. I notice several shirts in need of attention, and I can cook, at least simple things, once you've built the fire. Yates looked as though he might argue, but instead nodded. Fair enough. Though you'll promise to rest when you need to, I won't have you undoing Doc Wilson's prognosis out of stubbornness. I promise, Zoe said solemnly, though her eyes sparkled with determination. The days that followed established a rhythm between them. Yates would rise before dawn to tend his small herd of cattle and handle the daily chores of ranch life. Zoe would wake to find coffee already brewed and often breakfast prepared. As her strength gradually returned, she took over more of the domestic tasks, mending clothes, preparing meals, and even reading aloud from Yates's small collection of books in the evenings. They learned about each other in the quiet moments. Yates discovered that Zoe was the daughter of a professor who had lost everything in bad investments before his death, leaving her with no choice but to seek employment far from home. Zoe learned that Yates had come west as a young man of 19, working cattle drives before saving enough to buy his modest spread 5 years ago. What made you stop the nomadic life? She asked one evening as they sat by the fire, Zoe knitting a pair of socks from wool Yates had traded for in town. Yates considered the question, staring into the flames. Saw too many old cowboys with nothing to show for decades of hard work. No home, no family, just worn bodies and fading memories. Decided I wanted roots before it was too late to plant them. And have you found what you were looking for? Zoe pressed gently. Parts of it, Yates answered, his eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to the fire. The land is mine, the cattle are healthy, but a home needs more than walls and a roof. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Zoe felt her cheeks warm, and she focused intently on her knitting. On the 7th day of her stay, Sheriff Mills rode out to the ranch. He was a grizzled veteran of the frontier, with a perpetual squint and a reputation for dogged persistence. Miss Reynolds, he greeted her respectfully, hat in hand. Good to see you recovering. I need to ask you about the men who attacked you, if you're feeling up to it. Zoe described the robbery in as much detail as she could remember. 3 men, all masked, one shorter, with a distinctive raspy voice, who seemed to be the leader. The tallest had a scar visible beneath his mask, cutting through his right eyebrow. That matches the description from the other survivors, the sheriff confirmed. We believe they're holed up somewhere in the foothills. You're lucky to be alive, madam. I know, Zoe said quietly, her hand unconsciously moving to her side. Any chance of recovering my mother's jewelry? She asked, though she already knew the answer. The sheriff shook his head. If we catch them, perhaps, but likely they've already sold it in one of the mining towns where questions aren't asked. After the sheriff departed, promising to keep them informed of any developments, Zoe sat quietly by the window, watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. My mother wore those pieces on her wedding day, she said softly. It was all I had left of her. Yates moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. I'm sorry, Zoe. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something in the way he said it made her heart beat faster. It's just jewelry, she said, trying to sound practical. I still have my life, thanks to you. Thanks to your own strength, Yates corrected. Many would have given up. The storm broke that evening, rain lashing against the cabin windows while wind howled around the eaves. The temperature dropped sharply, and Yates built up the fire to ward off the chill. The close quarters seemed even more intimate with the world outside, raging in darkness. "I've been thinking," Yates said as they shared a pot of stew, "about your situation." Zoe looked up, curious. "What about it?" "The teaching position will be gone by the time you're fully healed," he said carefully. "And winter's coming on. Travel will be difficult, especially for someone still recovering." "I'm aware," Zoe replied, anxiety creeping into her voice. "I've been considering my options." "You could stay," Yates said, the words coming out in a rush. "Here, for the winter at least." Zoe's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "Stay? But that would be—" "I'm not suggesting anything improper," Yates clarified quickly. "There's the widow Jenkins in town. She could come out, act as chaperone. She's been looking for a place since her son moved to Denver." Zoe considered this unexpected proposal. "And what would I do here all winter? I can't live on charity, Yates." "Not charity," he insisted. "The ranch needs tending. I've been meaning to expand the herd, but that means more time on the range. Having someone to manage the household would be valuable." "You're offering me employment as your housekeeper?" Zoe wasn't sure whether to be amused or offended. "As a partner," Yates corrected, looking somewhat flustered. "A business arrangement. You manage the domestic affairs, I handle the cattle. Come spring, you'd have enough saved to go wherever you want. Denver, maybe, where teaching positions are more plentiful." The offer was practical, logical even, but Zoe sensed something beneath the practicality, a reluctance to see her leave that mirrored her own growing attachment to this quiet, thoughtful man. "I'll consider it," she finally said, "but let's wait until Dr. Wilson declares me fully healed before making any decisions." Yates nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Fair enough." The storm continued through the night and into the next day, keeping them confined to the cabin. Zoe used the time to take inventory of Yates's provisions, making lists of what would be needed for winter. If she did stay, certain improvements would need to be made for comfort, additional linens, cooking utensils, perhaps curtains for the windows. "You're planning already," Yates observed, catching her measuring the window frames with a piece of string. Zoe blushed, caught in the act. "Just considering possibilities," she admitted. "If I were to stay, this place could use a woman's touch." "It could indeed," Yates agreed, his voice warm. "Has been missing that since it was built." On the 10th day after her injury, Dr. Wilson returned to check her progress. "Healing nicely," he pronounced. "You've been following my instructions well." "Does that mean I can travel?" Zoe asked. The doctor hesitated. "You could, but I wouldn't recommend anything strenuous for another 2 weeks. Short rides only, no bouncing stage coaches." After he left, Zoe found Yates in the lean-to stable, brushing down his horse. "Dr. Wilson says I'm healing well," she reported. Yates paused in his brushing. "That's good news." "He also says I shouldn't undertake any difficult travel for another 2 weeks," she continued, watching his reaction carefully. "I see," Yates said, resuming his brushing with studied nonchalance. "And have you decided what you'll do?" Zoe took a deep breath. "I'd like to accept your offer, with some conditions." Now Yates stopped completely, turning to face her. "What conditions?" "First, this arrangement is temporary until spring, as you suggested. Second, I want a written agreement outlining my duties and compensation. Third, if the widow Jenkins can't or won't come, we find another suitable chaperone." A slow smile spread across Yates's face. "Seems you've given this considerable thought." "I have," Zoe confirmed. "It's the practical solution for both of us, and it gives me time to write to other schools about positions for the next term." If a flicker of disappointment crossed Yates's features at the mention of her eventual departure, he masked it quickly. "Then we have an agreement, Miss Reynolds. I'll ride into town tomorrow to speak with the widow Jenkins." That evening, as they sat by the fire, Zoe felt a curious mixture of relief and anticipation. The decision made sense, yet she couldn't help but wonder if she was allowing herself to be swayed by growing feelings for this solitary rancher who had saved her life and now offered her sanctuary. "Tell me about your dream for this place," she said, wanting to understand the man whose home she would be sharing. Yates looked surprised by the question, but considered it thoughtfully. "I want to build something that lasts," he finally said. "Not just a profitable ranch, though that's part of it, but a real home, the kind of place children grow up in and remember fondly." "You want a family," Zoe observed softly. Someday, Yates acknowledged, when the right woman comes along, someone who sees beauty in this hard country, who isn't afraid of the work or the isolation. Their eyes met across the firelight, and Zoe felt something shift between them, an acknowledgement of possibilities neither was yet ready to voice. The next morning, Yates rode into town as promised, returning by mid-afternoon with supplies and news. "Widow Jenkins has agreed," he announced as he unloaded packages from his saddlebags. "She'll come out next week. Says she's looking forward to fresh air after being cooped up in her son's house all summer." "That's wonderful," Zoe said, genuinely pleased. Martha Jenkins had a reputation as a kind but no-nonsense woman who had survived 30 years of frontier life. Her presence would not only provide propriety, but valuable companionship during the long winter months. Among the supplies, Yates had brought fabric for new curtains and a dress. Having noted that Zoe had nothing but his shirts and her ruined traveling outfit to wear, the thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her deeply. "How did you know what to get?" she asked, running her fingers over the soft blue calico. "Asked Mrs. Peterson at the general store," Yates admitted with a shrug. "Said I needed something for a lady about your size. She seemed mighty curious, but I didn't elaborate." Zoe laughed. "I'm sure the entire town is buzzing with speculation by now." "Let them talk," Yates said dismissively. "Anyone who knows me knows I'm not the type to take advantage of someone in need." The arrival of Martha Jenkins the following week transformed the small cabin. Within days, curtains adorned the windows, shelves were reorganized, and the scent of baking bread permeated the previously bachelor quarters. The older woman took one look at the sleeping arrangements and immediately set Yates to building a small partition that would give Zoe privacy while maintaining propriety. "Been meaning to expand anyway," Yates said as he worked, seemingly unbothered by the extra labor. "Come spring, I'll add a proper second room." Zoe, wearing her new dress and feeling more herself than she had since the attack, watched him work with growing admiration. There was a quiet competence to everything Yates did, a reliability that she found increasingly attractive. As October gave way to November, the first snow dusted the foothills surrounding the ranch. Zoe's wound had healed to a pink scar, though it still ached when the weather changed. Her strength returned more each day, and she found genuine satisfaction in transforming the sparse cabin into a proper home. Martha proved to be an excellent companion, full of practical knowledge about frontier living, and unobtrusive when Zoe and Yates shared quiet evenings by the fire, reading or simply talking about their days. It was during one such evening that they received unexpected visitors. Sheriff Mills arrived with 2 deputies, their expressions grim as they dismounted in the yard. "We got them," the sheriff announced when Yates met him at the door. "The robbers who attacked Miss Reynolds found their hideout in an abandoned mine shaft near Black Creek." Zoe, who had been working on a quilt by the fire, set aside her sewing and came to the door. "All 3 of them?" "2," the sheriff corrected. "The leader fellow with the raspy voice you mentioned was killed resisting arrest. The other 2 are in custody." "Did you recover any of the stolen items?" Yates asked, voicing the question Zoe couldn't bring herself to ask. The sheriff reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. "Some. Most was already sold, but we found this tucked away. One of the men said they argued over it, thought it might be valuable enough to save for a bigger town." With trembling fingers, Zoe opened the pouch. Inside lay her mother's pearl and sapphire brooch, the piece she had treasured most. Tears sprang to her eyes as she clutched it to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "This means more than I can express." The sheriff nodded awkwardly, uncomfortable with such emotion. "There'll be a trial next month. We'll need you to testify if you're able, Miss Reynolds." "I'll be there," Zoe assured him. "These men must face justice for the lives they've taken." After the lawmen departed, Zoe sat quietly by the fire, the brooch in her palm catching the firelight. Yates settled beside her, respectful of her silence. "My father gave this to my mother on their 10th anniversary, she finally said. "She wore it every Sunday to church. When she died, he couldn't bear to look at it, so it stayed in her jewelry box until he passed too." "It's beautiful," Yates observed, "like something from another world." "It is, isn't it?" Zoe agreed, seeing the brooch through his eyes, an elegant piece from Eastern society that seemed out of place in this frontier cabin. "Sometimes I feel like that brooch something from a different world, trying to find my place here. And have you? Yates asked softly. Found your place? Zoe looked up, meeting his gaze. I'm beginning to think I might have. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings, until Martha bustled in from the lean to where she'd been hanging herbs to dry, breaking the spell. That night, lying in her bed behind the new partition, Zoe listened to the wind howling outside and realized that for the first time since her father's death, she felt truly safe. Not just physically secure, but emotionally anchored. In Yates Parker, she had found someone who saw her strength rather than her vulnerability, who valued her mind as well as her domestic abilities. The weeks leading up to the trial passed quickly, filled with preparations for winter. Yates worked from dawn until dusk, securing the ranch repairing fences, ensuring adequate hay storage for the cattle, and weatherproofing the cabin. Zoe and Martha preserved food, made candles, and sewed warm clothing for the cold months ahead. On December 10th, 1872, Zoe found herself in the Greeley courthouse, testifying against the men who had nearly ended her life. Yates sat in the front row, his steady presence giving her courage as she recounted the terrifying events of that October day. "And you're certain these are two of the three men who attacked you?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes," Zoe said firmly, looking directly at the defendants. "The taller one has the scar through his eyebrow. The other was the one who shot me after their leader gave the order." Her testimony, along with that of other victims who had survived similar attacks, sealed the fate of the two bandits. The judge sentenced them to 20 years in the territorial prison, the maximum penalty short of hanging. As they left the courthouse, snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes. Yates wrapped Zoe's new wool cloak more securely around her shoulders. "You did well in there," he said, pride evident in his voice. Not many would have the courage to face their attackers so directly. "It felt important," Zoe replied, watching her breath cloud in the cold air. "Not just for me, but for the guide who died protecting me, and the others who didn't survive." They had taken a room at the Greeley Hotel for the night, with Martha acting as chaperone, planning to return to the ranch in the morning. As they crossed the street toward the hotel, Zoe noticed a familiar figure emerging from the general store. "Mr. Hargrove," she called, recognizing the school headmaster who had originally offered her the teaching position. The elderly gentleman turned, peering through the falling snow, before his face lit with recognition. "Miss Reynolds, my word, what a pleasant surprise. I'd heard you had recovered from your ordeal, but wasn't sure if you remained in the area." Introductions were made, and Mr. Hargrove insisted they join him for dinner at the hotel restaurant. Over roast beef and potatoes, Zoe learned that the school was still struggling to find a permanent teacher. "The young lady we hired after your misfortune left when she got engaged to a minor passing through," Mr. Hargrove explained. "We've had temporary arrangements, but with the new year approaching, the school board is quite desperate." Zoe felt Yates stiffen slightly beside her, but kept her expression neutral. "That is unfortunate timing," she said carefully. "Indeed," the headmaster agreed. "In fact, Miss Reynolds, if your health has recovered sufficiently, the position could be yours starting in January. We've held your references and we're most impressed with your qualifications." Zoe's heart raced. The teaching position, her original goal, her chance for independence and to use her education, was being offered again. Yet, instead of immediate joy, she felt torn. "That's very kind," she said. "May I have a few days to consider? The winter makes travel difficult, and I have commitments I need to address." Of course," Mr. Hargrove said genially. "But do let us know by Christmas if possible." The new term begins January 8th. After dinner, when Martha had retired to their shared room, Yates and Zoe found themselves alone in the hotel's small sitting room. A fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth didn't reach the silence that had fallen between them. "You should take it," Yates finally said, staring into the flames. "The teaching position. It's what you came west for." "It was," Zoe acknowledged, studying his profile. "3 months ago, I would have accepted immediately." "And now?" Yates asked, finally turning to look at her. "Now I find my priorities have shifted," Zoe said softly. "I've discovered there are different kinds of education, different ways to build a meaningful life." Yates moved closer, taking her hands in his. "Zoe, I don't want to be the reason you give up your dreams. Teaching is what you trained for, what you're passionate about. One of the things I'm passionate about, she corrected, her heart pounding. These past weeks have shown me I'm capable of more than I realized. I've found satisfaction in creating a home, in seeing immediate results from my labor. But is it enough? Yates pressed. The ranch is isolated. Winters are harsh. There are no lectures or books or intellectual discussions beyond what we create ourselves. Zoe squeezed his hands. Are you trying to convince me to leave, Yates Parker? A flash of vulnerability crossed his face. I'm trying to make sure you won't regret staying. The honesty of his concern touched her deeply. I need to ask you something, she said. Is our arrangement still just a business proposition to you? Because if it is, then yes. I should take the teaching position. Yates's expression softened, and he raised one hand to gently touch her cheek. It hasn't been just business since I found your pulse that day in the canyon, he admitted. I've been fighting it, trying not to let my feelings influence you. You deserve time to heal, to find your footing without complications. And if I told you those complications are welcome, Zoe whispered, that perhaps they're not complications at all, but clarifications? The kiss, when it came, was gentle but sure, a declaration of feelings that had been building since that first week in the cabin. Zoe's hands moved to Yates's shoulders, steadying herself as warmth flooded through her. When they finally parted, Yates rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Zoe Reynolds. I think I have since the moment you first laughed in my cabin, despite your pain. And I love you, Zoe replied, the words feeling right and true. Which makes my decision rather simple, doesn't it? The next morning, Zoe visited Mr. Hargrove at the school, declining his offer with genuine regret but absolute certainty. I've found my place, she explained. Though perhaps, when the weather improves, I might offer lessons at the ranch for children from outlying homesteads who can't make the daily journey to town. The headmaster, noting the happiness that radiated from her, gave his blessing. Education takes many forms, Miss Reynolds. I believe you found a worthy calling. Christmas at the ranch was a simple but joyous affair. Martha outdid herself with the cooking, preparing a feast from their preserved stores. Yates presented Zoe with a hand-carved jewelry box for her recovered brooch, while she gave him a new leather-bound journal, having noticed his old one was nearly full. As they sat by the fire that evening, Martha tactfully retired early, leaving them alone. Yates took Zoe's hand, his expression serious. I have another gift, he said, reaching into his pocket. One I've been carrying since we returned from town. The ring was simple, a gold band with a small but perfect sapphire that matched her mother's brooch. It was my grandmother's, Yates explained. My mother sent it when I wrote to her about you. You wrote to your mother about me? Zoe asked, touched by this revelation. Told her I'd found the woman I wanted to build my life with, Yates confirmed. If you'll have me, Zoe Reynolds, I promise to create a home worthy of your courage and spirit. Not just a house or a ranch, but a true partnership. Tears glistened in Zoe's eyes as she looked from the ring to the man offering it. Yes, she said simply. With all my heart, yes. The wedding took place on Valentine's Day, 1873, in the Greeley Church. The town turned out in force, curious about the Eastern lady who had survived being left for dead, and the quiet rancher who had fought for her life. Martha served as matron of honor, while Doc Wilson stood as Yates's best man. As they exchanged vows, Zoe wore her mother's brooch pinned to her wedding dress, a symbol of how the past and present had merged to create an unexpected future. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the congregation reflected the community's approval of this union that had begun in such dramatic circumstances. Spring came early that year, bringing new life to the ranch. Yates expanded the cabin as promised, adding not just one room, but two for the future, he explained with a meaningful glance that made Zoe blush. Together they planted a vegetable garden and an apple tree near the front door. Martha Jenkins decided to stay on, taking the small cabin Yates built for her near the main house. Got nowhere better to be, she declared, and someone needs to help when those babies start coming. By summer, Zoe had established a small school in the front room of their expanded home, teaching 5 children from neighboring ranches 3 days a week. The satisfaction she found in these lessons, combined with the deep contentment of her marriage, confirmed she had made the right choice. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the foothills in gold and purple, Zoe took Yates's hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "It seems Martha's prediction was accurate," she said, her eyes shining. "We'll need that second room sooner than expected." The joy that transformed Yates's face was everything Zoe had hoped for. He gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, which, to him, she was. "A family of our own," he whispered against her hair, "our own legacy." As darkness fell and stars appeared in the vast Colorado sky, Zoe reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The robbery that had nearly claimed her life had instead led her to a love and purpose she never could have imagined. The woman who had been left for dead had found not just survival, but a profound rebirth. "Any regrets?" Yates asked softly, as if reading her thoughts. "Not one," Zoe answered, leaning into his embrace. "Every step, even the painful ones, led me exactly where I was meant to be." February 1880. The winter wind howled outside the window of the expanded Parker Ranch house as Zoe tucked the quilt around her sleeping 6-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. Across the room, 4-year-old James and 2-year-old Thomas already slumbered in their shared bed, their blonde heads so like their father's peeking above the coverlet. 7 years had passed since that fateful day, when she had been left for dead and Yates had found her pulse. 7 years of building a life together, expanding the ranch into one of the most prosperous in the county, raising their children, and deepening the love that had begun in such unlikely circumstances. Zoe touched the scar on her side, now faded to a silvery line, a permanent reminder of how quickly life could change. She had long since made peace with the violence that had nearly claimed her life, seeing now how that terrible moment had ultimately led her to where she was meant to be. Quietly closing the children's door, Zoe moved through the house that had grown from Yates's humble cabin into a comfortable home with 4 proper bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and the front parlor that still served as a schoolroom 3 days a week. Martha Jenkins continued to live in her cabin nearby, though she spent most days with the family. Becoming the grandmother the children had never had. Yates was in his study once, just a dream, but now reality going over the ranch accounts when Zoe entered. He looked up immediately, his face softening as it always did when he saw her. "The little one's asleep?" he asked, setting aside his ledger. "Finally," Zoe confirmed with a smile. "Thomas insisted on 3 stories tonight." "He's determined, that one," Yates said proudly. "Like his mother." Zoe settled into the chair opposite his desk, smoothing her skirts. At 31, she had retained her beauty, though the frontier life had added character lines around her eyes and streaks of silver now threaded through her blonde hair. "I had a letter from Mr. Hargrove today," she said, referring to the now retired school headmaster who had become a friend over the years. "He says the school board is considering expanding the Greeley School and wants my opinion on curriculum for the older students." Yates smiled. "They still value your educational expertise, as they should. What will you tell them?" "That they should include practical sciences and literature beyond the basics," Zoe replied, "and that girls should have the same opportunities as boys to learn mathematics and history." "Revolutionary," Yates teased, though his eyes showed his support. "Will you continue your lessons here when they expand the town school?" "Of course," Zoe said without hesitation. "The outlying children still need education, and I love teaching too much to stop. Besides, Elizabeth will be ready for more advanced lessons soon." Their eldest child had inherited her mother's quick mind and love of books, devouring everything in their growing library and begging for more. James showed more interest in the ranch operations, following Yates everywhere, while young Thomas seemed to have a natural gift for music, already picking out tunes on the piano Yates had surprised Zoe with on their 5th anniversary. Rising from his chair, Yates moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape illuminated by moonlight. "I was thinking about that day again," he said quietly. "How close I came to riding past without stopping." Zoe joined him, slipping her arm around his waist. "But you didn't. You found my pulse when everyone else had left me for dead." "Best decision I ever made," Yates said, pulling her closer. "Sometimes I wonder who saved whom." "Perhaps we saved each other," Zoe suggested. "You gave me life that day. But you've given me so much more since then. purpose, family, a home that means more than any position or status ever could. Yates turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the same love that had sustained them through difficult births, harsh winters, and the everyday challenges of frontier life. "Do you remember what you said that night in the Greeley Hotel when you chose the ranch over the teaching position? That I had found where I belonged," Zoe recalled, smiling at the memory. "And have you?" Yates asked, a familiar ritual between them. "Found where you belong?" Zoe reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that 7 years of Colorado sun and wind had etched there. "Every day I'm more certain," she answered. "This life we've built, it's everything I never knew I wanted until I found it." Their kiss was as tender as their first, yet deepened by years of shared experience, joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle, all woven into the fabric of their marriage. Outside, the wind continued to blow across the Colorado plains, but within the walls of the Parker Ranch, there was only warmth and the quiet certainty of two people who had discovered that sometimes the greatest journeys begin at the moments when all seems lost. For Zoe Reynolds Parker, being left for dead had ultimately led to being truly alive, not merely surviving, but thriving in a life rich with purpose and love. And for Yates Parker, the decision to check for a pulse in a seemingly lifeless form had given him not just a wife, but a partner who made every aspect of his dream for the ranch more vibrant than he could have imagined. Together, they had transformed tragedy into triumph, creating a legacy that would live on through their children and the countless students who passed through Zoe's schoolroom. It was a story neither could have written, alone a tale of second chances, unexpected paths, and the healing power of love on the Colorado frontier.